why do you think yoga is so, in this day and age, has so much to do with strength and flexibility and having to know a lot of information, like a lot of knowledge?
Yeah, well, I think that actually what I would call the distortion of the presentation and understanding of yoga probably began quite a long time ago, even before yoga came to the West. Um, in within the clashing of Indian and European culture, within which you could say Indian culture was swamped and overwhelmed by European culture, and then there was a response to that later, um, and within that response, it seems to me, and there are people who've tried to historically justify it, that yoga somehow was kind of watered down to something more manageable, more um, usable. Not, I think, in that process intentionally more marketable, but that's one of the side effects of the process, in that yoga became, rather than self-inquiry, it became a process of self-improvement, self-development, self-enhancement, um, and in that happening, it really lost its roots and it lost its significance and power, but it gained accessibility. Um, and so what we've seen, maybe 100 years after that happened in India, um, let's say only in the last really 25 years, um, is an incredible renaissance or resurgence of the use and awareness of the word and the practices of yoga in the West, which really began, as far as I can see really in the early 90s. Um, and by the end of the 90s, yoga had gone from being something very definitely marginal to something mainstream and very um, lucrative, especially in America, because there's such a huge market there, um, of people with disposable income, people with a lot of time. And remind me what your question was.
Why there's that yoga seems to
Ah,
be
yes.
this.
As within that context of yoga, actually, even coming from the people in India, the Indian gurus themselves. So I don't think that this distortion can be laid at the feet of Westerners. They were given this idea that yoga was the best way to go about self-improvement, self-enhancement, self-empowerment, things that were Western concepts. They were kind of seduced into thinking, here's an Eastern technique that's been used to great effect for a really long time for this purpose, which actually isn't true. Um, but of course, the fruits of self-inquiry are so beneficial that um, it can look from the outside like a process of self-improvement, self-enhancement, whatever. Although, of course, everybody knows, maybe they don't, that really spiritual practice has something to do with losing the self or transcending the self, whatever that might be supposed to mean, rather than improving, strengthening, enhancing the self. So, of course, the body, as the most overt expression of your identity, of your presence, of yourself, um, is the easiest arena within which to make improvements. It's much easier to change um, the way you move, the way you look, than it is to change the way you think and the way you react. So I think this has just happened serendipitously. I don't know if you can use that word in a negative sense. It's just happened. It's just happened. Cultural forces, um, and part of it is the the massive increase in demand in the 90s, in the last decade of the last century, so that there wasn't adequate provision to supply that demand from people who had real experience and real understanding. So that meant that very quickly yoga started to be transmitted as a form of Chinese whispers. People saying what they'd been told, who'd been saying what they'd been told who'd been saying what they'd been told, without possibly even any real experience anyway along the line. So this has meant that yoga has really become very little more, to my mind, than an exercise form that, because it doesn't overtly subscribe to the normal motives of exercise, which is basically vanity, because it subscribes to other motives, so-called spiritual motives, has to contextualize itself with what I call a soundtrack. Now that soundtrack can be in the silence of the practitioner's mind, or it can be coming across a sound system, or it can be coming from the teacher. And the essence of this soundtrack is you could call esoteric spirituality, non-Western spirituality, Indian spirituality, normally mixed up with Western concepts of New Age self-help and self-development, and a bit of Chinese and a bit of Japanese and a bit of native Indian, all kind of mixed up into this, what I call a meaningless esoteric soundtrack. It's meaningless in many ways because it doesn't relate directly to what's actually happening on the mat. What's happening on the mat is body part relationships are being changed. In other words, forces are being applied to the vulnerability of the joints. And if you're thinking about or listening to this esoteric soundtrack, it's not only meaningless, it's dangerous, because it's distracting you from being able to respond effectively to the impacts of the actions that you're taking.